this week's Watercolor Techniques video on Patreon. And today we're going to talk about two things that are really useful for all of our watercolor projects, and that is lifting and softening. And lifting is something that we do to remove paint from the page, or to clean up edges, or to lift color where we need highlights, or certain areas that we don't want that much watercolor paint. Softening is how we put down a hard edge and then soften that edge into the picture. So it's really helpful to get shading techniques and for shadows, and also like adding in dimension on skies and things like that. So there's some very specific techniques for this and some specific brushes that we want to use. So I have here just a page of just kind of washes that I did. Some of them are ink, some of them are handmade watercolors and regular watercolors. And I wanted to start with that because these have been dry and on this paper for several months. And this is just a cold press 100% cotton watercolor paper. And what you will notice when you're doing this work is that some paints that we use are staining. That means that the pigment embeds into the paper and stains it and makes it harder to lift. And so we need to know about this when we're creating with our watercolors. We need to know which pigments are staining and which ones are not. So one thing that I want you to have is a paper towel, a clean piece of paper towel, and also some clean water that you only use for lifting. So I'll keep that one clean, and then I have another jar of water to rinse my brush if I'm painting. And I wanted to show you a basic lifting technique. So I'm going to go, for instance, I'm going to go into this ink here. This is a brown ink by Pelikan. And if I take a brush and dip it into clean water, this is just a number 6 pointed round, a synthetic by Skoda. It's called a Skoda Perla. And if I take some of just water, clean water on a brush, and I just sort of scrub it back and forth on this brown ink, and then I touch it with a paper towel, some of it will come up on the paper towel. So some inks will let you and some won't. But let's go to watercolor. This is watercolor, and this is a handmade watercolor. Same thing, I'm just going to take my wet brush and just sort of lightly sweep it over. I'm not using too much pressure because I don't want to abrade the paper. Blot it with a paper towel, and it barely comes up. So this one here, if I go in a little bit more where it's darker, scrub it back and forth, blot it, it barely comes up. Okay, now I can take a stiffer brush. This is a very, very stiff synthetic brush, and it's made for this purpose. This one is made by Princeton Velvet Touch, and it's called Willow's Blender. This is a 1/4 inch, okay? So this bristle, if I take it into this watercolor and I move it back and forth, is a little bit more aggressive. So we really do have to be careful, but you can see that it lifts up quite a bit more paint. So if we really are stuck, and especially if we're cleaning up edges, or if we spill a little bit of watercolor on the paper and we want to remove it, we can use one of these stiffer scrubber brushes. So if I move around here, over here, this is more handmade watercolor. And if I do the same with this brush, these colors, you can tell, lift up quite a bit easier. So I can take my other regular pointed round that's a bit softer, and move it through. And it also lifts fairly well, okay? All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going, let me just say one other thing. With handmade paints that are made out of a lot of earth pigments and mineral pigments and gemstones, they really vary. Typically, earth colors lift up quite a bit easier, okay? They're not really staining, but there are some handmade paints that are staining. And I'm going to show you a simple test that you can do to figure that out. So no matter what paints we're using, whether they're handmade paints or traditional watercolor paints, we do the same test. And what I'm going to do is just take some clean water in my pointed round, and I'm going to swatch out my split primary color. So here is Hansa Yellow Light, New Gamboge, this is Transparent Pyrrole Orange, the warm red, a little bit more, Cool Red, which is Quinacridone Rose, Warm Blue, which is French Ultramarine, and Cool Blue, which is Phthalo Blue green shade. Now, if we put paint down and we want to lift it right away, basically what we do is we clean our brush and dry it off, and we can take the point of our brush and run it through. Dry the brush off, run it through again, and I keep drying the brush off to remove the old paint and running it through. So you can see that the phthalo blue lifts a little bit, but it is a staining pigment because it doesn't lift completely. But if I go through the French ultramarine, you can see that it starts to lift almost right away. And if I keep cleaning my brush and running it through, it's going to really lift it back to almost the white paper. Okay? So French ultramarine blue is not a staining pigment. So if I move up to the transparent pyrrole orange and do the same test, I want to make sure my brush is dry. Swipe it through, rinse it, dry it off, swipe it through. You can see that it's lifting. Okay, so it's not so much a staining color. If I go through Quinacridone Rose, and I should say it's not so much a staining color while wet. We're going to do it again once this dries. So this is lifting fairly easily when it's wet. Then I'll come up here to my Hansa Yellow. Hansa Yellow is a very staining color. So it's going to be a little bit harder to lift, but it does lift a little bit when wet. And then New Gamboge also lifts fairly easily when wet. Okay, so we're going to let these dry, and I'm going to turn my paper around and show you some other things. So let's say that we're painting a flower petal, and I'm just going to put some water down and just in a basic petal shape to give myself a water glaze. And I'm going to use some of the Cool Red, the Quinacridone Rose, and I'm going to drop it in to the flower petal where I see it darkest on the petal. So usually when we're painting a flower, we're looking at a reference and we see areas of the petal that are darker than the others, and some are in highlight. Once that's down, I can rinse my brush and dry it off. And I want to run my brush around the edges to make sure that the paint moves out to those edges and gives me a nice clean edge. But what I also want to do is I want to make sure that I reserve the highlights, so I can take a clean damp brush and I can run it through while it's still wet, and I can lift out the highlights. You see that? How it lifts out very nicely while it's still wet. If this were dry, it wouldn't be so easy, and we would probably risk damaging the paper to bring it back to this level of brightness. Okay, so that is a lifting technique. So let's say, same thing, let's just say we've painted a flower petal. And let's say one edge of the flower petal is very soft and almost fades to white. So immediately, while it's still wet, I can take a clean damp brush and run it along the edge to soften that hard edge. Rinse my brush, dry it off, and to continue to run the brush around to soften that edge. You'll hear me say that a lot when we do projects that I'm softening. And that is what that means. I'm taking a hard edge and I'm turning it into a soft edge. Okay? So those are two examples of lifting and softening. Let's say that I'm painting and I'll take some warm red and I accidentally get paint on my paper. Okay? If that happens, we're also going to use a lifting technique, but we're not going to do it while it's wet. What we can do is take a clean paper towel and just press it down, lift it off to remove any paint that's still wet and hasn't soaked into the paper, but you'll notice that there's still a little bit of paint there. So instead of putting my brush right into the wet paint, I'm lifting off the paint first. Then I'm going to take my scrubber brush or clean damp brush and I'm going to lightly use clean water to move the scrubber brush around, and then I can lift it off and the paint is almost entirely gone. If this paint was already dry and you went back to do it, you might have to do this a few times. If you have to do it a few times, you are going to abrade the paper. There's no getting around it. It's going to happen. So only do this if it's a spill on a painting where you don't have to paint again. Okay, so if I dropped blue paint into this flower petal, I would probably not be able to remove it and then paint over it. Okay, unless I dabbed it up right away and just tried to make the best of it. But lifting paint off paper that you don't need to paint over again, you can afford to abrade the paper a little bit. Try not to, but it usually does. And then just blot it up. And you can clean your edges up. So also, this is very, very useful. I'm using a smaller pointed round here. This is a number 2, I think. Number 2. And let's say I'm painting a flower petal or anything, and my edges are not clean, like you can see right here. So once it's dry, I can take clean water on the tip of my brush and I can lightly rub it back and forth to clean up that edge and then blot it up with a paper towel. I might have to do it a couple times, so I'm being very careful to not go into the flower petal, but I'm just going on the outside where I see that those edges are not totally smooth. Dab it up. And you can get quite a bit you have quite a bit of success with this method to clean up edges. Sometimes we don't want a soft edge though, so we want to make sure that we're leaving a hard edge behind because we can soften fairly easily by doing this too. But you can see how it really lifted all the extra little bits. I'll do it one more time. Sometimes I do it 3 or 4 times just to make sure that my edges are nice and clean. Okay, so that's another really useful thing for lifting, okay? So let me go back here. Let's see if they're dry yet. I think so. All right, so I'm going to go back to these examples, and I'm going to take a clean damp brush, and I'm going to run it through the phthalo blue back and forth, and it is dry, and lift it. You see how it barely comes off the paper once it's dry. I'm going to do the same in the French ultramarine. And you see how it lifts from the paper as well as it did when it was wet. French ultramarine is not a staining color. So you can test all of your pigments to see if they are staining or granulating. Going up to the transparent pyrrole orange. It does lift a little bit, not as well as the French ultramarine. So it is staining, but if you even took a scrubber brush, very, very carefully, if you really needed to lift, you could do it. Okay, it's not as staining as phthalo. The phthalo colors are typically very staining. Going into the quinacridone rose, back and forth, does not lift off, okay? So quinacridone, all of the quinacridone colors are very staining. And then going up into the New Gamboge, it does lift a little bit. And into the Hansa Yellow Light, it does lift, not very much. So typically the yellows are very staining, okay? So that is how we lift color. We use clean water on a clean brush, very gently go back and forth, and then dab it with a paper towel to lift the color up, okay? Now, let's say, let me try to think of something, an example here. So let's say we're painting a leaf and we're going to mix up some green. And we're going to use warm blue, with a little bit of warm yellow. And we'll get a nice leafy green, maybe a little bit of cool yellow too, just to brighten it up. I'm going to paint a leaf shape. And you probably notice when you look at botanical art, a lot of times there's some really fancy vein work. I can drop in my green on one side where the leaf is darkest, okay? Rinse my brush, dry it off, use the tip of my brush to clean up those edges, make sure the paint's going all the way to the edge and down the stem. Might need a little extra paint to take it down the stem. Drop in a little bit more on this side because I really want it darker over here. And then rinse my brush and clean it off. Do the same on this side. Because the paint is sort of slowly evolving, sort of encroaching on the side that I did not drop the paint in. And what that does is it gives me instant shading, okay? So I can go through now with a clean, damp brush, and I can immediately just sort of lift out where the vein's going to be. And do it again. And one more time. So because I have some staining colors in there, it's not going to be dramatic yet. But here's the thing, we have it lifted already. Once this dries, we can go in with our brush again, do that little scrubbing motion, and lift out the vein with paper towel. So let's do that another time. Actually, I'm going to use clear water again. Let's do it right here. So we'll do another leaf. Drop in our color. We'll drop in our darker color on the right side. And we'll drop in a little bit of lighter color on this side to give the leaf some variation. Clean our brush, dry it off, and go around our edges to make sure that the paint is moving all the way to those edges. Rinse our brush, dry it off. Sweep through where the vein's going to be. And we can even sweep through this way because maybe we'll have veins on the side, on one side that we want to see. And when it dries, we're going to see that faintly, okay? Now, Another thing, we'll go back to that when it's dry. Another thing, let's say that we're painting a sky. And I'm going to put some water down. And I'm going to drop in some ultramarine with a little bit of cool red. Leaving a couple little spaces that I want to be clouds. So here's the thing, we can soften the edges of those clouds. We can, and lift. We can go in with our clean damp brush and lift paint to give ourselves better edges on our clouds. Okay, and then when that dries, we can go in and we can put a little bit of shadow and a hard edge on part of it to make it stand out even more and soften, and I'll show you that once this dries too. So I'm going to let these things dry and then I'll come back to show you these two techniques. Okay, so these are now dry and I want to show you a few things about softening. So lifting is pretty straightforward. We're basically lifting paint, and I showed you the technique how to do that with clean water and lifting it up, blotting it up with a paper towel. So if you look here at these two leaves that I painted, they're very faint because this is the first layer, but you can barely see this sort of light area that I've lifted through. What's better about this than simply avoiding that area is that we can get a smoother wash, a more fluid wash, without having to carefully paint around a small vein. And the other thing is that it's not completely white. Okay, so if we needed it completely white, we would have to paint around it. But I actually have never had that situation, so I just do it this way. But it's given me a lighter area that I can work around. So what I want to do is wake up that green and that yellow green, and maybe even a darker green. So I'll mix up more of the warm blue with a little bit of warm yellow to get a very, very dark green. Okay? And I'm gonna, now what I can do is I can paint starting with the lightest color. So I'm gonna paint very carefully. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna use my smaller brush. It's too big for this. So I've got the lightest green that I mixed up. And I'm gonna paint very carefully right up to that vein that I lifted out, the lighter area that I see, all the way down, painting right up to the edge. And then I can pick up some of the mid-green and I can drop it in where I see it darker, even like right up against the vein and down here at the bottom. And then I can pick up some of my darkest green and very lightly drop that in right along the vein, and it's just sort of flowing over what I've already put down. Pull it down along the stem if the stem is dark. And I'm still going to clean my brush off, dry it, and then just sort of go over my edges to make sure that my edges are smooth. Okay? And then I can do the same on the other side. I turn my paper to do that. Start with the lightest color. And the same thing, I'm taking it right up to that center vein, leaving that center vein the color that it is, so not painting over it. And then moving the paint all over this side of the leaf. Picking up some of that mid-green, dropping it down here toward the bottom of the leaf, a little bit around the center and toward the top. and even a little bit along the edge. And because the leaf is already wet with that light green, the paint flows freely and I don't get any hard lines. Take some of the darkest green, drop it in down here at the bottom, and even right along that center vein and at the tip. So now I'm starting to get a leaf with more dimension without having to paint very carefully if I were to have painted around that vein from the very beginning. It's really important when we're painting things that have very subtle gradations in color that the paint can flow freely and mix and mingle with each other so we don't have to soften. Okay, so that is one way to do it. But let's say I don't want to do it that way, and let's say over here I'm going to take my darkest green, and let's say this leaf is really dark at the bottom, so I'm going to put in some of that dark green, pull it up to that center vein, and let's say it's dark to about here, okay? And then over here it comes up just a little bit dark. So I can soften by cleaning my brush, drying it off, and using the clean damp brush to run along the edges of that dark green to soften it. So you'll hear me say that all the time when we're painting. Then we're going to soften the edge, and this is what I mean. We're just running a clean damp brush along the edge to soften it so it's not so hard. I never want to put a wet brush into it because that's just going to make it bloom. But I can soften these edges, okay? So I get that nice edge, but it's not totally hard. Then I can go back in with my medium green and just drop it right in, and it will just blend right into it. So softening is a really, really useful technique, okay? I can even soften this green here and pull it down into the stem. So that's another way to do it. And because I always have to finish two sides, I'm going to do a little bit on the other side. So I'm going to take a little bit of the dark green, put it down here at the bottom, clean damp brush, and soften it. So softening is just sort of blending it out so it becomes lighter. Pick up some of my mid-green, drop it in, and then avoiding that center vein, just pulling it all the way down here to the bottom. So again, we get a very realistic leaf effect by softening. Okay, so those are two ways to do it. I can go back into this leaf again with a third layer and do some dark green and soften and do the same thing. So it's just different techniques to achieve the same effects, okay? Now let's go back to our sky. And this is a very small slice of a sky, and it's fine, but it needs a little oomph. So I'm going to use my bigger brush again, and I'm going to take some of my warm blue, my French ultramarine, and I'm going to put a harder edge on the top of these clouds so they really stand out. But let's say I go in and I sort of paint a cloud shape on top, give it a little more character. And I can't leave it like that because that looks really silly, right? So I can leave that hard edge around the edge of the cloud, but I can soften around it by dipping my brush in clean water and just pulling it down. And then I'm going to have to do it again on this side. So dip my brush in clean water and then start softening that top edge. pulling the clean water up to the top. I can drop in a little bit more. And it's just going to mix and mingle and blend right in. Okay, so now I have this nice crisp edge on the top of my clouds that I really wanted. But I also need some shadow underneath. So I'm going to mix a little bit of warm red into my ultramarine to sort of gray it out, to get sort of a purpley gray cloud color. And I'm just going to put some shadows at the bottom of my cloud. But I can't just leave it like that, right? It doesn't look right. So again, clean water, push it into that edge, keep rinsing my brush and drying it off, and I'm just softening that edge so it's not hard. And I can do the same thing underneath. I'm just running the clean, damp brush along the edge of that paint, and I'm softening it. Okay, so see how I could add that realistic looking shadow without creating a hard edge. And I can do the same over on this side. Just drop in my shadow color. Rinse my brush and dry it off. Soften the top edge of the cloud. I always do the top edge first because it really does need to be soft. And then go underneath and soften the bottom edge. You can even drop in a little bit more while the paper's still wet if you want to emphasize it, but it will still have that soft edge. So that is another application that I use softening quite often. And this is even, if it encroaches too much, I can pull my clean damp brush through, and I can lift some out if I feel like it's too strong. And I'm being very gentle with my paper. Okay, I'm not scrubbing too much. I'm just using my brush very gently. I would never use the scrubber brush for this technique because I know I'm going to be painting more in this area, and I might want to drop more in. And if I scrub too much, it's going to abrade the paper, and then the paper is going to soak that paint right up and look really funny. It just won't look right. So this is another application for softening that's really, really important. So remember, lifting is when we are using clean water to remove paint. So here I'm going to go back into this quinacridone rose, use my scrubber brush back and forth, dab it, and I can lift a little bit. It's much harder once it's dry, okay? But I can still do it a little bit. All right. Going into the ultramarine, even though it's totally dry, because it's not a staining color, I can lift it right up. And then softening is when I put something down and it might be a really hard edge on both sides. And I only want, let's say, the top edge to be hard, and I can soften by running a clean damp brush over that hard edge. I can soften it. Another thing this is really, really good for is for shadows. So let's say on our leaf here, we have a shadow underneath it. So I'm going to mix up a shadow color just by kind of mixing all of my palette together here to get a gray. And I'm going to just put some of that shadow color underneath my leaf. And I want to soften that bottom edge of the shadows because sometimes shadows have really hard edges, but hardly ever. We always want to soften that bottom edge of the shadow. I can just run my clean damp brush over that one edge of the shadow and soften it. And then I can take it darker right up underneath it. not a great example of a shadow, but you know what I'm saying. So when you put a shadow under something, let's say I want to put a shadow under this that I just painted, and this is a plate or something, and I put my shadow color down right underneath it, and then I'm going to take a clean damp brush and I'm going to soften that edge. So the shadow slowly disappears. Then I can go back in and I can drop in darker shadow right up against the object. So that is another great application for softening. So I hope this was helpful. These are just really handy techniques that you need to know for no matter what you do in watercolor. You have to know how to lift and you have to know how to soften. And so these are things you can practice. You can also practice by swatching out your pigments in your paint set and seeing which ones are staining and which ones are not. Typically, also another thing is that granulating colors do not stain. So for instance, French ultramarine blue is the only pigment in the split primary system that is granulating. And so hence it doesn't stain. It's very easily lifted from the paper. So if you're painting a sky, if you use phthalo blue, it's going to be harder to lift those cloud shapes out and harder to soften and to add things to it. So I typically use colors that are granulating for my skies. So things like if I wanted a cool blue, I would use cerulean blue, or I could use Prussian blue, or chromium blue oxide, or things like that that are granulating and easier to lift. Okay, I hope this was helpful. I hope you all have a great rest of your weekend, and I will see you next week, hopefully with news of my new grandbaby. All right, take care. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.